Hello, and welcome to the second presentation of the Fall 2019 season of the Medical History Interest Group. We're very happy to see you today. Yesterday's, if we'd had this yesterday, it would have had to have been after midnight, early this morning. The Medical History Interest Group presentations are sponsored by the Lawless Library History Collections and the Department of Bioethics and Interdisciplinary Studies. If you haven't already done so, please sign the attendance sheet before you leave. Refreshments are available over there. Please help yourself. The upcoming presentations are on Monday, October 28th, Eastern North Carolina, and the 1918 influenza epidemic with Lane Carpenter, M.A., archivist at Lawless Library. And then on Monday, November 11th, Coca, Cocea, and Cinchona, medical marvels and curiosities from the Iberian New World with Angela Thompson, Ph.D., history retired. The current second floor exhibit is celebrating 100 years of public health nursing in North Carolina, and the other exhibits are all on this floor. There's a pop-up exhibit about medical photography and illustration, both here and around the corner. In Lawless Library, we're celebrating 50 years of history and service, and scientists and their microscopes. Today's presentation is Ink and Silver, Medicine, Photography, and the Printed Book, 1845 to 1900. Our presenter is Stephen J. Greenberg, MSLS, Ph.D., Section Head, Rare Books and Early Manuscripts, History of Medicine Division, United States National Library of Medicine. Steve Greenberg received his doctorate in early modern history from Fordham University in 1983 with a dissertation on early printing and publishing. After teaching for several years, he returned to school and earned his library degree from Columbia University in 1991, specializing in rare books and archival management. Since 1992, he has worked in the History of Medicine Division at the U.S. National Library of Medicine, one of the constituents of the National Institutes of Health, where he is currently head of the Rare Books and Early Manuscripts section. His research and publications span a number of fields, including the history of printing and publishing, the social history of medicine, the history of medical librarianship, and the history of medical photography. So here is Steve Greenberg with Ink and Silver, Medicine, Photography, and the Printed Book, 1845 to 1900.
Thank you. Am I turned on? Yeah, oh, yes, I can hear myself. Okay, so first of all, I just want to take a minute to thank Melissa and Courtney and Mike and everybody else for helping to set this up. And I also want to thank Piedmont Airlines, doing business as American Eagle, for finally figuring out how to get me from Charlotte to here after 9.5 hours on the ground in Charlotte, in case you're wondering about the midnight last night thing. I also want to take a moment to explain the title of my paper. Some of you may be familiar with the very prestigious Photo Quarterly Aperture. And Aperture for many years was edited by a photographer named Minor White, who was a wonderful photographer and a terrible publisher. So they gave him an assistant publisher, and the assistant publisher was an okay photographer, but a good publisher. And the publisher was complaining to Minor White that the pictures never looked as good in the magazine as the original prints that they were given. And Minor White said, well, yeah, you know, this is ink and this is silver. They're not going to be the same. And of course, nowadays, in virtually every print that we see is an inkjet. And the inkjet prints are very, very similar to the inks that are used in the printed books anyway. That dividing line has gotten much thinner. But what I'm trying to investigate this morning is the crossovers. What was required to get pictures in front of people, and could you trust them? And that's my little sermon. I also get to do this from three different points of view. First, as a historian, which I theoretically am, and as a librarian interested in the history of books, but also as an amateur photographer, because as Melissa pointed out, I have all these initials after my name, which means I was in graduate school for way too long, and I made something of a living in those years as a photographer and also selling cameras retail in New York City. So I get to look at this from all sorts of angles. And that is not one of my cameras there. That is a French double box camera from about 1845 in the collection of the George Eastman Museum. Used to be George Eastman House, now George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York. And the reason why it's called a double box camera is you'll notice that little structure along the back. There are actually two concentric boxes that moved in and out. That's how you focused the camera, because the lens is just nailed on. It's not going anywhere. There's no focusing heel quite there. And the fun thing about this camera is that it could be used with the state-of-the-art photographic processes of an era for almost 100 years. And chemical staining on the back of the camera indicates that it was used for multiple processes, from wet plate to Daguerreotype, all sorts of things. And with our modern cameras, they don't last very long technologically speaking. So let me move on. So some of you may be familiar with this, but I'm going to tell you that this is not Emily Dickinson. It's a Daguerreotype of Emily Dickinson. Yes, at some point she was sitting in front of the copper plate that was in the camera, but this is not her, it's an image of her. And of course the thing about Daguerreotypes, and we'll talk about this more in a little bit, is that Daguerreotypes are by definition unique. There was no negative, there was no way of reproducing them, there was a one-off. So of course you're not actually looking at the Daguerreotype, which is up at Amherst, you're looking at a gelatin silver print. But actually you're looking at a halftone of the print, and then someone scanned it to make a JPEG, and then they dropped it into PowerPoint. So what I'm trying to say is you're an awful far way away from the original here. And there's an awful lot of distance between the image that we see and the thing that was originally sitting in front of the camera. It's rude to call Emily Dickinson a thing, but you get my point, I think. And of course, I can't think of any other field of human endeavor except maybe car racing, where we worry so much about the tools that we've got. So this is not a camera. A camera is a room, right? That's what the word means. And technically, you know, the term camera in this sense comes from the term camera obscura, which was a device which goes back to the early Renaissance, where you took a room, and it could be a big room, made it perfectly dark, punched a tiny little hole in one wall, and the light coming in would project an image without a lens, upside down on the following wall. That's a camera obscura. And that is in fact the physics behind the way a camera would work in this sense, because the image is being seen through the lens, inverted, and then projected against whatever medium we're going to capture it with. And of course, at one level, this is a tool, right? You know, it's like a pencil or a wrench. It's nothing special, it's just a thing, right? Except it's a Leica. And for those of us who know anything about cameras, Leicas are like the holy grail of photography. They were the first commercially successful 35mm camera. It's often said that Leica invented 35mm photography. That isn't quite true, but it's almost true, because they made one that worked and could be sold. And Leica has been the camera of choice for many fine photographers for many years, because it was small and portable and virtually bulletproof. And of course, it's become such a thing that there are people who buy Leicas to collect them and not ever use them. I see a couple of people are smiling. Anyone out there own a Leica? Yeah, well. That doesn't count. Well, you know, they did that first. They were a microscope company first, back when it was Ernst Leitz, L-E-I-T-Z. And Leica is actually Leitz camera. Okay, that's where the acronym comes from. Leica has just announced a digital camera called the Leica Monochrome M. It only takes black and white pictures, and for a digital camera that's hard to do because it means you're dumbing something down. And it, instead of having like little black leather ready kind of things on it, it's got miniature pictures that someone else has taken from their collection. And this will cost you $15,000, though they'll throw in a strap. Okay. And there are people that will buy this thing and put it in the bank vault. And it's very hard to take pictures with a camera that's in the bank vault. Okay. And of course, this particular camera is a Leica M3 from the 1950s, and it shoots this funny stuff we used to call film. And it seems that 35 millimeter film is making something of a comeback, which is a little weird. It's kind of like vinyl records. Like, I remember when vinyl went out, I don't want it back. I mean, too many scratches and pops for me. So if at some point 35 millimeter film does in fact disappear, this will become a paperweight. And then of course, 5,000 years from now, people have no idea what this thing is. You know, it'll be an item of ritual significance. And this is really not a camera. This is a Nikon Z7. This is 45 megapixels of digital lust, and it does things that you can't imagine that any camera could possibly use, because this is a computer with a camera name stuck on the front of it. This particular model, which is the current model, has a setting that if you tell it to, it will not only look for the faces in your viewfinder, but if it sees one that it likes, it focuses in on the eye, because that's the thing the portrait photographers always want to have in focus. Okay, and in the dynamic focus setting, it follows the eye, so the little box bounces back and forth. And if you're thinking of like, I'm going to take something and go and take a picture, the Z7 has 900 pages of instruction manuals, which you can download as a PDF and keep on your phone. And I do. And for those of you guys who did the art student thing, okay, you know, this is Magritte, this is not a pipe, it's a picture of a pipe, but you know, little surrealist thing. And photography is essentially surrealistic. Because if you think about it, we look at it and pretend it's reality and it's not. Because after all, the world is not two-dimensional. The world is not the size of the little viewfinder. There's something else out there. So, and by the way, I want to take another moment here to thank Melissa and her gang for getting out all these lovely books we've got out here that are mentioned. So if you ever want to start thinking of photography as something more than just taking pictures with your iPhone, you kind of want to take a look at this book by John Szarkowski, who was the curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art for oodles of years. And I don't normally like to have big quotes up here on the screen, but this one's kind of important. Because if you're going to look at how photography and medicine get to be buddies, and they do, you have to understand that when photography was being invented, they had no idea what they were inventing and what it could be used for. And this is true, of course, of any historical inquiry, but if you look at the past using only the lens of what we have from the present, you're going to find yourself in trouble. So let's drop back to the 19th century. This is from the Lancet, and you guys all know what the Lancet is, right? There you go. That's easy. One of the first times in the Lancet, in an editorial, that photography is really discussed. Okay, the art of truth and truth in art, the essential means of reproducing all forms and structures. Oh boy. So what do we expect from photography, and what did they expect? Do we expect photography to be honest and accurate and reproducible? I mean, when was the last time you took a picture on Facebook and sent it out to your 500 friends, some of which you have no idea who the hell they are, but they friended you, so you friended them back, right? Okay? We have infinite reproducibility, and they did not. Honesty, accuracy, well, that's in the eye of the beholder. So I've got some object lessons on this one. So, this is from 1855 by a photographer named Roger Fenton, who is arguably the first war photographer, and he's taking these pictures during the Crimean War. And for all you literature majors, this is the charge of the Light Brigade, you know. This is the Valley of Death, in rode the 600. In other words, 600 English cavalrymen who charged off in the other direction got themselves killed. Okay. And we have two pictures taken by Fenton here. And you'll notice that the angle's the same, the light's the same, but the one on your left, you've got all the cannonballs on the road. And the one on the right, the cannonballs aren't there. And we do not know, excuse me, whether he put the cannonballs on or took them off. 1855. And there's a gentleman named Errol Morris who's done a lot of work on this. He did satellite imaging and tried to figure out where the shadows would have fallen and to figure out which one was taken first. And the results are ambiguous. Thank you very much. But obviously something happened, and one of these pictures is not accurate, or it is not honest. And we will never really know which came first. I kind of think he put the cannonballs on because Fenton was a little bit of a charlatan in other ways, but you know, no convictions. So Alfred Stieglitz, one of the great photographers in the first part of the 20th century, also an enormous proponent of modern art, was one, he did the first showing of Brancusi and of Georgia O'Keeffe and this guy named Picasso. But he was also a photographer, and he was very much into the, I photograph what is there, I do not change anything. And he did. I mean, any photographer decides where you're going to frame the picture, what you're going to leave in, what you're going to leave out. If I just take a picture of you, and I've got a real camera, because this won't work with a cell phone, I can decide whether you're going to be in focus or not by adjusting things on the camera. And sir, I could take a picture of you and decide whether I want to include you in the picture or not. I'm not lying, I'm not changing reality, but this is a subjective thing. This isn't some engraved truth here. So here is Stieglitz, who cropped the picture, who changed the picture after the picture was taken. And there are, in fact, 4 different versions of this in what is called the key set. And if you're not familiar with the key set, Georgia O'Keeffe, who was married to Stieglitz for a long time and was executor of his estate, made several standard sets of all of his known prints and gave them to different cultural institutions. Okay. She was a busy lady, but that's a lecture for another day. So I don't know which picture I like better photographically. I'm rather fond of the snowdrift, okay? Because that, to me, that's a real New York City snowdrift, okay? Because that snow is not white anymore. So like, that's New York. But whichever one you like, he made a decision afterwards to alter something. And I actually put this picture in because you used it for the poster. So this is a really famous picture, okay, fading away. And here's the young lady dying romantically, probably of tuberculosis, because that's what you died romantically of in 1858. Okay. And you've got the mother and the grandmother and the father looking out the window and like, isn't it lovely? And he actually caught some flack. How dare you, you know, burst in and invade the family's privacy in this moment of grief? And like, guys, it's a photograph. It's staged, it's posed, and it is also 5 different photographs put together. And I've numbered the areas. And when I say 5 different photographs put together, what I'm saying is this: 5 different exposures on glass plates, cut and put together like a jigsaw puzzle. And here's why. Photographic film of the 19th century, which in this case is what is called a collodion print, which is an emulsion put on a glass plate and exposed while it's still wet, was very, very sensitive to blue light and very, very insensitive to red light. So if you were taking a picture of a sky with a lot of blue, it would blow it out, and anything red would basically turn black. This is, by the way, if you watch old black and white movies, why the women's lipstick is always black, because it's really red. Then the other thing that's going on here is what in the photographic world is called dynamic range. So let's go back to Bio 101. Okay, remember they used to tell you that your eye is like a camera? That's wrong. Your eye is so much better than a camera. So much better, because it has a much higher dynamic range. And what that means is this: if I'm looking at something that's brightly lit, but there is something that is dimly lit in front of it, your eye will see them both, a camera will not. It will black out one or the other. So, ma'am, I'm looking at you, and you've got the sun on your face, but I have no trouble seeing the side of your face that's in shadow. And Courtney, who's in more shadow, I can see you quite clearly because my eye has a dynamic range of about 12 f-stops. And cameras don't. Now, there is in the digital world this thing called high dynamic range photography, HDR, which is to some people like, okay, because it's changing reality. But basically what you do with HDR is you take a series of pictures, 3, 5, 7, 9, with a variation in the exposure. And then your software says, I'll take this from here and this from here, so you have a much wider dynamic range. Well, Photoshop had not been invented yet, and so this picture is put together the way it is. And you'll notice the sky showing the clouds, that's all that blue light out there. So if that's going to be properly exposed, everybody else is going to be in direct shadow. And this wasn't a secret. You know, he wasn't pretending. But a lot of people got bent out of shape because he said, you know, this isn't reality, this is art. And whether photography is art, that's, again, for another day.
So did they all have to stand there for that exact how long?
I don't know, but the two women on the right were taken at the same time, but the old lady and the guy could have been added later. Okay. And probably were, because those are the kind of curtains you find in a photographer's studio. So, but again, you know, think glass cutter. And since the number of prints made was relatively small, you could kind of go over with a little, you know, paintbrush covering any gaps. This was actually invented by a French photographer who was doing landscapes, okay, and Gustave Le Gray, and you just like zip across the horizon line and expose one for the below and one for the top. So much easier to be a photographer today. So much easier. You can make so much trouble. So these are kind of my 3 stooges today. We have Louis Daguerre, Daguerreotype. I am told that it actually should be pronounced Daguerreotype, but I've never heard of anyone that actually does that in public. So like, we'll go with Daguerreotype. So he was not fully the inventor of the process. He had a buddy who we'll talk about in a moment. But basically, Daguerre was the first person to actually make money from photography. And of course, the Daguerreotypes, as I said, were one-off. There's no negative. It's a copper plate with a silver emulsion, and it's exposed and then developed in fumes of boiling mercury, which is why all these guys die of mercury poisoning, because they spend their entire, forget OSHA, this is the 19th century. It's amazing how any of them lived. Okay. Daguerre was a painter and was quite the artist, so that's why daguerreotypes actually have some real artistic structure to them. Fox Talbot invented a different process which is called the calotype, and the calotype is the first negative-positive process. So you're basically, whatever's in the camera is being exposed, what the light is striking turns dark, but it shouldn't, and so you make another print, and then the dark things become light things. The trouble with the calotype process is he's using it with sensitized paper, and so you're seeing the texture of the paper, which means that daguerreotypes are lovely, but they are not sharp. And if you're interested in a process that's going to give you detail of a surgical operation, okay, that is not going to help you. Now, most of you have heard of Daguerre. Some of you may have heard of Fox Talbot, but you probably never heard of Frederick Scott Archer because he's the guy that actually came up with a process that had negative-positive but was sharp. He used a substance called collodion. Collodion is clear and flexible and sturdy. Basically, you take cotton, nitric acid, stir them up, wait for the cotton to dissolve, then dry the residue, and be very careful because at this point it's called gun cotton, and you can actually use it in your bullets. And then it's dissolved again in either alcohol or ether, and you get this clear, flexible stuff. And then you can put your photographically sensitive chemicals in the goop, put it on your plate of glass evenly. Yeah, right. And then what you do is make sure it's on, and while it's still damp, you have to expose it. There's a wonderful photographer named Sally Mann. She's based in Northern Virginia, who actually does these, and I encourage you to there's a video out on YouTube somewhere, and you can see her. And you know, the funny thing is the emulsion is so insensitive, she doesn't have to do it in a dark room. Okay, you could probably do it if I turned off the panel, and I'm not turning off the panel, Mike, it's okay. If you turn off the panel, it'll be dark enough to do it. So imagine taking a 16 by 20 glass plate and pouring maple syrup on it, and then trying to get it evenly on the plate, and then when it begins to dry, you put it in your camera. Right. Later, the chemicals became more sensitive, so it could be shot dry, but these first few years. And the reason why we don't think about Scott Archer very much is that the darn fool died very young and never tried to make any money off the process, so he died young and poor. He said, "This is wonderful, I'm giving it to the nation," which is not a way to pay the mortgage. So the man behind Daguerre was this unpronounceable Frenchman named Nicéphore Niepce. And Niepce actually was the first person to permanently capture an image using light and chemicals. And you may have seen that picture. The original, by the way, is in Texas at the Harry Ransom Humanities Research Center. It's a piece of pewter about that big. And it looks a little weird because the exposure was so long, it was 8 hours. You're seeing the actual sun going all the way across the image. So the shadows were on both sides. So if you're wondering like, what? But the picture on the right is actually what Niepce was trying to do. Okay, he wasn't interested in photography. He didn't know what photography was. He was trying to figure out a way of using chemicals and light to etch a printing plate, what we would now call photo engraving. And this is one of his first attempts. The idea being that somehow the chemicals could be used to etch the plate with an image that was in fact photographically or chemically put on. So let's talk for a moment about how you put pictures in books anyway. And here I have to thank the fact that I come from the National Library of Medicine. We got these things. So here we have two anatomical books. The one on your left is from 1390. It's from a Persian book of anatomy. And don't be fooled. The picture looks a little like some sort of a weird Cabbage Patch doll, but their anatomy was pretty good. This is hand done. It's ink and watercolor, which means It's unique. There are other copies of the book, but it's all hand done. Remember, 1390, Gutenberg doesn't start printing in the West until 1450. And of course, they're printing in China and Japan long before, but that's out of the scope of what we're doing here. The fun thing about this book is that Arabic books of the same era do not have images, because the Arabs and the Persians had different interpretations of thou shalt not have a graven image thing going on there. By the way, this book has been scanned. It's on our website if you want to download it, because we do that. Okay. There's about a dozen showing different bodily systems. And again, they said, well, this is stylized enough that no one can say it's a real person, but you read the text and you realize they really knew a lot more than the drawings. And then, of course, we had Decathlon, the first printed anatomy book in the Western canon, and it's 1494, the Fasciculus Medicinae. And you'll notice that what you're seeing is the signs of the zodiac, because this is humoral medicine, guys, okay? 4 body fluids, 4 seasons, 4 elements, all being affected by the zodiac. So if you come to me and you're sick, I want to know your sign, so I know how to treat you properly. So, yeah, it's not almost as good as a Myers-Briggs, right? So it got better. Over here we have Vesalius, which is probably the most famous of the early Western anatomy books, and certainly the first accurate one. These are wood blocks, and they're, about this big. So when you're doing a wood block, you're basically making like a big rubber stamp, and you're carving away the bits that you don't want, and more about that in a moment. And if you keep them carefully, wood blocks will last you a long time. The blocks for Vesalius lasted until the 1940s. They were in, I believe, Dresden. Being in Dresden, being made out of wood was a bad choice in the 1940s, so the blocks were destroyed. And then Albinus, this is French, this is 1749. The accuracy is not all that super duper, but I love the rhino in the background. So there's this whole tradition, you can see it in Vesalius as well, of having art. And remember, these are not being presented as how to draw your model. It's not that kind of book. These are anatomical textbooks for surgeons and physicians. Okay. You can actually, the Vesalius is like what, a dozen of what they call the muscle men, where they peel off one layer at a time. And the picture of the landscape in the background, you can actually piece it all together, and it's the landscape of the Italian countryside outside of where Vesalius was studying in Padua. Vesalius was not Italian, by the way, he came from Brussels. And the rhinos were fashionable. They brought one up to Paris that year, and everybody had to have a rhino in it. So, wood blocks. And here you're seeing actually several stages, but you can see here how the wood's been carved away. Here it's been inked, but up there it has not. So what sticks up will print, what's cut away will not. And it's called a relief process because it's in relief off the surface. Limitations, you can't get a really, really, really fine line or else the wood will crack. But the good news is you can print an awful lot of them. They don't wear out if you're careful with them. And also you can print them at the same time as you're printing your text, because the same printing press for your type will also work for the wood block. So for printers, it's a win. Okay. Bad news is if you're making a wood block and you cut away a little bit extra, it's kind of like, oops. So when I was in library school, I have no talent with wood blocks or engravings or any of these other processes, but they made us do them so we'd know what they were. And I was supposed to wood block picture of King David. Okay, this is this little biblical thingy, and they basically put the picture on the block and you carved it away. And you knew it was David because, had a crown and a harp with 5 strings, because that's King David, right? except by the time I was done, he had only one eye and only 3 springs. So he was a biblical balalaika player. Okay. So this is kind of the other way. This is, actually, this is a Rembrandt plate. This is the actual copper plate it's printed from. Excuse me. And this is called intaglio because you're cutting into the metal below the level of the plate. And you are carving into the metal, or you're etching, I'll explain that in a moment. And then you ink up the whole plate and rub off all the ink except what's in the grooves, which sounds like so much fun. And then under great pressure you print and the image comes out. And those of you who have business cards or wedding invitations where the print is raised like that, they don't actually do those by etching or engraving anymore, but it's supposed to give you that feel. So the good news about etching and engraving is get a much, much finer line because copper doesn't split. The bad news is copper doesn't split, but it's relatively soft, and if you press the pressure, eventually you're going to flatten out the plate. Which is why in a Rembrandt they talk about the state of the engravings and etchings, because whenever the plate wore out, he would do the picture, but he might change it a little bit. So technically, if it's purely done with a little chisel, it's called a burin, it's an engraving. The other sneaky way to do this is you take the same copper plate and you cover the whole thing with wax or some acid-resistant medium, varnish will work. And then you scratch through the varnish with your picture. Then you put the plate in nitric acid, and we've scratched away the wax of the varnish. The acid eats into the plate. So that's etching. But of course, it's sometimes really hard to tell the difference. It's important to librarians sometimes, okay, because you have to know what you're looking at, okay? Because no etcher was ever so happy with when the plate came out of the acid, they didn't take the tool and do a couple of extra little squeakies back and forth. So more detail, smaller number of impressions, and also because of the higher pressure, you could not put this picture on the same page as your text unless you ran through 2 presses, one for the words, one for the picture. So it's a pain in the neck. It is helpful, though, to librarians, though, because if you're looking at the book, you can make some guesses as to edition size. If something's got a lot of engravings in it, then you know the run has to be relatively small. And if you compare back and forth with different copies, you can see how the plate is aged as it got flattened out. So bibliographically, it's useful. The other big process, and we'll hear about this more in a minute as well, is lithography. And lithography works on what I call the salad dressing principle. So work with me for a moment. Think of a bottle of Italian dressing. You got the vinegar, you got the oil, and they settle out. And you shake them as hard as you can, and you get them in some sort of suspension for a moment, but then it goes back out again. Because oil and water don't mix. So that's the way this works with lithography. You actually take a rock, okay, and that's a piece of limestone. And limestone is porous, it will absorb water. And you draw your picture on the stone with some sort of water-resistant medium. It could be ink that's greasy, it could be a crayon, it could be a pencil. Then you wet the stone. And where there is your picture, the water does not go in. But where there is where it's just plain, the stone gets wet. Then you put ink on top of the wet stone. It's a very messy process, by the way. Where the stone is wet, the ink doesn't stick. Where the stone has got the greasy bits, it does stick. And this is the fun part, because people don't realize this. The picture's all in black on the stone, but you've got colors because you see, excuse me, the second ink, the printing ink, could be any color of the rainbow. Just because the image is black on the stone doesn't mean you're going to print it black. Because you're not printing from that image, you're printing from the, from the second setting of ink. And this becomes a very, very, very popular way of doing color pictures in the 19th century. Now, some lithographs are printed in color. Some of them just have a black outline and they're colored in. And you can usually tell the difference in a magnifying glass. But as book editions get bigger, obviously there's more reason to try to do it using multiple stones with one color and ink. It's the beginning of what's called color separation. And it's either red, green, blue, or yellow, magenta, cyan. Okay. Now, these days, for those of you who either hang out in Photoshop or do printing, you have what's called CMAC, which is the C in CMAC stands for black because they couldn't use the B because that was the blue. So CMAC is yellow, magenta, cyan, and black because it's really hard to get a real pure black. And you got those cute little desktop printers. You know, remember the old ones with you had the black cartridge and then the yellow, magenta, cyan cartridge? That's how you got. Okay. And if you are a photographer and you've got your own printer at home and it's like, you know, an Epson 3880 or something like that, it's got like 9 or 12 different ink cartridges to make it perfect. Except you've got like 5 blacks, which is weird. So let's drop back and see how medicine tried to use photography. So daguerreotypes, you know, the ones that survive are kind of random. You got the copper plate and things happen to them. And you can find them in, you know, junk shows and flea markets and such. And you'll probably recognize one person here. That's Edgar Allan Poe down on the lower right. But I also want to bring to your attention, and again, I want to thank Melissa and her people for bringing up stuff on this. The gentleman in the upper left who is holding, it's a metal rod. Anybody familiar with that gentleman? Yep. Okay. His name is Phineas Gage. And Phineas Gage was the victim of a rather spectacular industrial accident. So in 1848, he was working on the railroad. And his job was to drill holes in rocks, fill them with gunpowder, tamp them down with the metal rod, and then blow it up. Except one day he's doing this and the rod hits a little bit of flint, causes a spark, the gunpowder explodes, and the rod goes right through his head. There are very few gross out pictures in this presentation, but this is one of them. By the way, the interesting thing about this report on the accident is this was done before his death. So this is the surgeon figuring out, you sir look horrified. You've not seen this before. Yeah. Yeah.
How do you survive that?
It's 1850. It's dumb luck. I understand he had a kind of a foul temper, and as you can see quite clearly, whoops, wrong way, sorry. Lost the eye there. It took out a whole chunk of the frontal lobe, and he had like seizures and things. But like, yeah, it's amazing what these people lived through. But the weird thing is, this photograph is a DAG. It's a unique thing. And this is basically what's called a stipple engraving, and not a bad one. Okay. So I started looking around and going like, obviously, doctors could use this process, but making a daguerreotype is a pain in the butt. Okay. And I was looking for something that I know must have happened, which is doctors getting together, you know, over port and cigars and passing around daguerreotypes of their problem patients, like this guy. So this wasn't quite around the table, but Dr. Llewellyn was in practice in Georgia, and he had this patient and had no idea what was going on. So he had a daguerreotype made. There's no indication that Llewellyn was an amateur photographer or ever did this again, and sent it up to his preceptor in New York, Valentine Mott, and this is actually in the collection of the New York Academy of Medicine, and said like, what is this? Okay. Now, here's the back of the picture. The patient's name is Jackson. There goes HIPAA right out the window. Also, I put this in for another little business the little mirror shot. If you ever go to a flea market and you want to buy a daguerreotype, here's what you want to do to make sure that it's real, okay? Dags are basically silver and mercury on copper, and at one angle they will form a mirror. And you just wiggle it around so you find the angle. And if you can't find that angle, it's not a dag. It's an ambrotype, which is cute, but like ambrotypes are worth about 1/3 of what a dag is. So this is the same picture, just wiggled around to the right angle. Okay. And these are thanks to people who knew I was looking for this and said, hey, we got one for you. You know Arlene, don't you? At the Academy? Okay. Anyway, it's good to have friends. So this is the first medical book that claims to be illustrated entirely from photography, okay? And it is a course of microscopy showing blood cells, and it says that these are illustrated by daguerreotypes. Well, obviously they're not, because there's not a bunch of copper plates in there. And here's a close-up. And what I think is going on here is someone is actually, if they actually did manage to attach a daguerreotype camera to a microscope, which would have been like remarkably top-heavy, okay. And then someone, I think, did some sort of an etching, because this does not look like anything other than really an etched plate, because you have nice granularity there that you're only going to get from acid. Okay. So basically, it's not the picture, it's an artist drawing from the picture, which is a recurring theme. So here are paper negatives, okay. So Fox Talbot, rather like, you know, the Earl of Grantham, had his own abbey. His abbey was called Laycock Abbey. And here you have the negative, okay? So the window is the dark part, because it's where the light's coming in, and you can see the texture of the paper, and then the print is just as bad. But multiple copies could be made if you didn't mind the lack of detail. Now, there was a way you could get a detail, and basically you're doing something like this, which is basically the stuff we all did when we were scouts. You know, you put the leaves on the paper and leave out the sunshine, and there you go. And this comes from a book that Fox Talbot produced over many years called The Pencil of Nature. And it's fun because this is a book that looks like it's photographs, okay? You know, the sort of thing you do with your iPhone. And they're a little smudgy, and again, when you see the texture, what you're seeing is the texture of the paper. And these were produced in quantity. And of course, the emulsions are very low in sensitivity. You're putting one piece of paper on top of another piece of paper. The negatives are often treated with either oil or wax to make them more transparent. But it's, you know, it's kind of smudgy. It is often said that Pencil of Nature is the first book of photographs, period. And that's not true, because guess what? A woman did it first. Okay. It's a different process. It's called a cyanotype. But Anna Atkins published the year before an entire album of photographs done cyanotype, but she doesn't get the credit for probably the usual reasons. Okay. So, a couple of the medical specialties have always been more interested in photography than others, and one of them remarkably is psychiatry. So Hugh Diamond was a psychiatrist, and by the way, I know using the term psychiatry in the 19th century is kind of like creaky, because they're not really psychiatrists, but I'm going to use it because it's the closest. And I could argue whether psychiatrists should be used for some people now, but that's another story. So what you have here is a photograph, and this is a wet plate, you know, the Fox, bling, bling, bling. You know, the glass collodion plate process. And that's the original photograph that was done in 1858 by Hugh Diamond, and it's now in the Royal College of Physicians archive. But he wanted to get it into a magazine article on using facial types to diagnose psychiatric conditions. So what you've got over here on the right is a litho. So someone, again, did a painting from the young lady. Well, she's not young. And she's got suicidal melancholy, in case you can't read it from here. And of course, they're honest about it. It says, and you cannot read this, from a photograph by Dr. Diamond. So this one's pretty good. This one's got senile dementia. They were very big on the idea that you could diagnose from here. And this one's a little farther out. Okay, she has religious mania. I don't know, the way she's given that photographer the eye there, I'm not sure that's all that's going on. Okay. But again, he went through great effort to get these pictures printed. And the only other way to get pictures in a book that were like really the photographs, not paintings from the photographs, was basically to do a scrapbook. And that's what this gentleman did. Okay. So Duchenne de Boulogne, famous early neurologist, did these series of pictures. The books were printed in 1862, though the photographs were done earlier. And as you can see, electrodes are being stuck on this poor guy's face, and they are going zip. Okay. These are, by the way, what's called albumin prints, where it's a glass plate negative done on a piece of paper where egg white is used to hold the emulsion to the paper. So he did a number of people. There's the actor, looking very melancholy. The little girl in the middle who's trying to figure out what happens when informed consent for underage patients. And then this other woman is giving the face. But this is the most famous one, this model. And supposedly he had some sort of facial paralysis and could not really do any expressions without the electrodes. And I've got a problem with this. Okay. We know a fair amount about the experiments. We know that the electricity was provided by a battery, or a voltaic pile, as they called them back then. Though we don't know how much, which means, of course, it was DC. It was direct current. We don't know how much electricity was produced because the thing hasn't worked about 120 years. But I've got two problems. And here's a close-up. Problem number one, the operator's hands are directly on the electrodes. Whatever electricity is going to the patient's face is also going through the operator. Number two, and this is why it's so wonderful to work at NIH. So I called up some people I know at the National Institute for Neurological Diseases and Stroke, NINDS, and I said, figure 70, 80 volts, amperage we don't know. How long could someone hold this position without twitching? And there's some difference of opinion because neurologists don't ever like to be definite about anything. If they want to be definite, they become surgeons, right? And they said, snarky, they said, 5, 10, maybe 15 seconds. And I called up my buddies at the George Eastman Museum, and I said, how long is the exposure for these pictures? And they go, hard to tell because they all wanted to be neurologists, you see. But, there's no evidence of artificial light, flash or anything like that, so 45 seconds to 2 minutes. So we have a little dissonance there. Now, I suspect, and I have no compelling evidence, that what's really going on is the experiments were done, someone did a quick sketch, and then the old guy who actually had a very mobile face mimicked the poses that they were asking for. And we will never know. So this is the first significant publication of the U.S. Army Medical Library and Museum, which grew up to be the National Library of Medicine, by the way. And it's their history of medicine during the American Civil War. And they wanted this to be top stuff, so they really put in every kind of process they could do, and Melissa's got some copies out there for you to look at. So a lot of the images are, once again, lithographic paintings from actual photographs. So you've got an albumin print over there of Corporal Edson Bemis, who did not know how to duck. He was wounded at, as you can see, Antietam, the Wilderness, and Petersburg. And you can see he's got the arm down there and the forehead. Hey, he was alive 10 years later, so like tells you something. But yeah, that's remarkably accurate. But again, it's not the photograph. That's the expensive way of doing things. The cheap way was to do a special kind of woodcut called a wood engraving. And the wood engraving, what you could do very nicely was to put it in with the text. So here is General Barnum, and General Barnum has a fistula that never healed. And I don't know if you can see it, but someone's very thoughtfully painted a little arrow showing where the bullet came in, and then in the mirror you can see where it came out. And then you've got the wood engraving. Hey, 52 caliber soft lead bullets, right? But this is, again, very, very impressionistic stuff. So once again, we're back to the psychiatrists. Of course, Charcot's a neurologist too, but that's okay. So Charcot, who ran basically the psych wards at the Salpêtrière, which is the big Paris hospital, was again very interested in doing a process called a colotype. Colotypes could be put into a book and printed in multiple copies. And a colotype basically is a way of sensitizing gelatin. And I think Knox is unflavored, not lemon jello. Okay, and you put your chemical, your light sensitive chemical in the gelatin, put it on a plate, and where the light strikes the gelatin, it not only darkens, but it stays harder. And then you can rinse off the rest of it. So you end up with a gelatin plate from the photograph, and you can make multiple copies. And you'll see that you get this funny little texture. If you look at them through a really sharp glass, they look like little cheese doodly things. And this worked out pretty well. It was easily reproducible, gave you fine detail, gave you a really nice grayscale, you know. With engravings and etchings, you got black, you've got white, and that's kind of it. Okay, this gave you more texture, and it could be done in books, but not with text. But the real game changers were these two processes, gravure and relief halftone. And again, they are photographic ways of making a plate from the original negative. And what you did is you had your light go through the negative, but with a screen like this stuff, okay? And it would break the light into little black and white dots. And you ended up with these kind of patterns. Now, the differences between gravure and relief halftone are technical. Gravure is technically an intaglio process. You're going into the plate, and halftone, you're up from the plate. You can see the dots very clearly over on the right. This is the guy's chin from the picture before. Okay, see, he's laying down there. There's his chin. The distance between the centers of the dots do not change because it's set by the screen. But the diameter of the dots do. So when something is darker, you have bigger dots. And of course, if you do this multiple times with different colors, you end up with a full color halftone. This is what makes printing in books possible, but still expensive. And this is really, right up until the computer era, this is how it was done. Halftones were cheaper, gravures were more precise. You could do a gravure on a newspaper press, and you curve the plate so it would fit around a rotary press, and you called it a rotogravure, as in your Easter bonnet, you'll see your picture in the rotogravure. And of course, nowadays, everything has changed. So this is a obstetrical textbook from the middle of the 18th century, and this book is big. That is not an iPhone. That is a full-size iPad. Okay? There's a very distinct effort to make these pictures full-size. Because this is the time in the history of obstetrics when the physicians are basically kidnapping childbirth from the midwives, and that's a whole other thing. You can do a lecture on that, right? Okay. But the National Library of Medicine, God bless our pointy little heads, we have decided that we're going to scan every book in our collection published before 1923, which at the moment is the copyright year under U.S. law. And it's changing in January. Finally, there will be the damn date. Yeah. Okay. Anyone know the story of how 1923 got involved there? It has to do with Mickey Mouse, and I'm not kidding either. Okay. So we're scanning everything. And by the way, if you ever need a book that we have not scanned yet, and it's in the public domain, have the library put it into library loan, and to fill that loan, we'll bump that book to the head of the line and send you a PDF. But then again, it's not the original, okay? And the political message of this book, okay, is lost when you see it on your iPad. And I love my iPad. That's what I was doing, for the 9 hours yesterday in Charlotte, because I had my iPad and my Kindle. I was a happy boy. Okay. So let me end with one more quote, okay? I think Drew rather sums it up. They didn't know what they were doing. They knew it was cool, and so they kept on doing it. So thank you for listening, and I believe I can answer questions. Thank you, Dr. Lincoln.
If you haven't already done so, please sign in this attendance sheet. That's your permission to be here, and it lets us get funding for such things as the refreshments. And there's, based on the fact that this is a two-day event that's taking place over one day, we have refreshments in the back and also to the side. And you've probably been in places where there's a question, there's an answer, and there's no question. So that's why, if you have a question, if you have a question, please raise your hand. I will bring the microphone to you. And that way, you will get both the question and the answer on the recording. And we will try to be, when this recording is up, we'll try to give it more publicity than we normally do, that it has been recorded, because we realized that a lot of people were unable, who had planned to come yesterday, were unable to come today. So was it you who had the question earlier?
I mean, I have a question, but I don't know if I had one earlier.
Okay.
What do you do now? We live
I
for
do
the
now.
moment.
I was curious, when did they start using photography, photomicroscopy? When did that become standard practice?
Pretty early on. I mean, that's what they're trying to do with the Daguerre book in the 1850s. They're trying to come up with something. The tricky part with that is the cameras are so big, okay? And so you end up having to have your microscope going this way, okay, horizontally. But that's one of the things that led to the early development of the Leicas, because they were looking for a camera back that could attach directly to a microscope, okay? I mean, there's more of a story to that, some of which is probably apocryphal, about how the guy that was the designer for Leica was an amateur photographer, and he had asthma, and he wanted to build a camera for himself, okay, and his name was Oscar Barnack. But Leica starts, the lenses, the mounts for the lenses, the diameter was also the mount they were using for the oculars. So early on.
Yeah, in my field, it seems like it's about 1900 when they started.
That would be about right.
About right,
Okay. The other thing is you need a film that's sensitive enough, and when you're dealing with glass plate negatives, you've got a whole lot of crazy going on. But yes.
Okay.
I remember reading somewhere that people had experimented with daguerreotypes to try to make them into an etching for printing. Can you talk about the success or failure of that process?
The failure of that process. because basically you needed something you would etch into the plate. Okay, so the chemistry was hard. It's what the Holy Grail was, okay, because again, they were trying to invent photo engraving, okay, but then other things come along that just make it easier. The big thing is lithography, because lithography is so versatile and you get color, okay. So until you get the separation processes, okay, it's hard to do on a metal plate, okay. But it was certainly, it's what they thought photography was going to be, okay, but it took a lot longer to do that.
For the Stieglitz, the terminal, I know that one of them was cropped, but it also looked like there had been other photo manipulation. One was very grainy and the other seemed sort of softer, and I was wondering, first, is it a glass plate?
Yes, it's a glass plate.
Okay, and then I would assume that if it had been manipulated, it would have been the red-blue process?
We may be looking more at the quality of the images I could get to use. So I'm not...
Because I know with like 35 millimeter, you would use graphite to take away some of those blemishings.
You could certainly do that. There's all sorts of stuff. There were these inks and paintbrushes as well. I would not think that Stieglitz would have done that. I think that we're looking here much more at differences between the digital images I could find. Okay. It would be interesting, if you want, and you've got someone who wants to buy you a nice present, you can get a copy of the key set. And it was very nicely done. You can see there are more differences there. Okay. It sets you back about, I think, $200, give or take. Amazon is cheaper.
Now, when I saw that, I assumed that he'd gotten closer for the one on the right. And that it was a case of, although I guess it would be hard to get closer while that man is not standing straight.
Yeah, and by the way, he's using a 4x5 box camera on a tripod. He's not doing this with his iPhone. Okay. No, there's only one negative. There's only one negative. And if you look, the steam coming off the horses, you could never get that twice. Also, it looks to me as though the print on the top was selenium toned, and which is why it's warmer, okay, which would have been done to the print and wouldn't affect the negative. But at this stage in his career, he wouldn't have been manipulating more than that. I mean, early on when they're doing their really romantic-y stuff, photography is remarkably artsy in the first few years, and that's what he's really working against. They do all sorts of weird things. There was one process called gum bichromate where the stuff that it's gum arabic has been added to the chemicals that are being used, and it stayed soft for a little while, and you could move it around and brush it with a comb and things. And you could add things to color it. And since it was the 19th century, it was Victorians, and they were really weird about dead people, you could have a picture done of your departed loved one, including some of the ashes from their cremation in the gum bichromate. And we won't even get into the pictures of the dead babies, which they did in great quantity. So.
That's funny that you said that, because I actually had a question about postmortem photography, which I collect.
Okay.
But I was wondering, I mean, it was like a cultural thing, but was it used a lot in like medical science? Did they do a lot of postmortem photography for like documentation or?
More for forensics is my understanding, okay, because you wanted evidence. It always amazes me how few postmortems are done, okay, and how a lot of death certificates get assigned. And And I also wonder, when you go to CDC and you see all those nice little neat statistics, how many of them are actually done by the work of a resident who was told, look, he showed up in the emergency room, his heart stopped beating, cardiac arrest. Like, well, But my understanding is, and of course, that has to do with distribution too, which is the whole point of this. If you're taking the pictures, how easy is it to share them with someone over there? It's when photography, I mean, this is like the Eastman Kodak thing. You push the button, we do the rest, all right, which is like just around 1900, where suddenly taking pictures doesn't require this huge amount of equipment. What you don't see, I'm going backwards constantly here. What you don't see here is that Fenton's driving around the Crimea with 2 assistants and a wagon being drawn by a horse. And that's his darkroom because he's got to do the plates immediately and expose them and then, before they dry. So it's hard to do. When cameras get small and cameras get easy, okay, and you can either run it down to your drugstore or your son will do it because it's his hobby, or your daughter. Okay, I mean, doing daguerreotypes is like, oh my God, it's just crazy.
I've seen pictures of medical students with cadavers.
Oh, sure.
From the late 19th century. Do
Yeah.
you know when that began?
Yeah, John Harley Warner, you've got a copy of that here, right? Those sections? Yeah, there's a whole book about that. It was a thing, it was a rite of passage thing. I mean, med students are strange people. But so I used to be married to a doctor, a psychiatrist, by the way, which explains some other things. And it's first time you go down to the lab, it's like, ooh, but it's what you do. And I think it was a rite of passage. It was this is pure sociology, a little bonding over the cadavers. There's a certain, memento mori thing, because the cadavers often have signs saying like, you're next, and things like that. But many reasons to look into Christian Science, what can I say, rather than going to medical school.
We have a bibliography, and Dissections is one of the books I looked at and decided not to bring out here. So Lane didn't have a choice in which one, putting that one out, unless she wanted to go out and bring it up. I decided that instead I would use Shooting Soldiers, which is actually a little smaller and has examples after example of wounds from the American Civil War. So, just make sure you get a copy of our of the bibliography, and you could even, since you're at Joiner, you could request it. In fact, that's something I wanted to say. This is a reprint of that book in the last slide. It's the gravid uterus, meaning the pregnant uterus. This is a small version of that because it's actually bigger than life size. And I decided, therefore, not to bring it out. It is probably our biggest book. And besides all the other interesting things, such as the photographs, it is literally dedicated to King George III from the year before the American Revolution starts. So it's 1774, 1775. I think it's 1775. So this is a case of, you want to see it, we'll bring it out. And
you really don't get it on an iPad. You really don't.
The books here, I've brought 2 books from Joiner, and I knew that photographic books were big, and I was thinking 2 or 3 books. I'm not a very tall person. I decided just to get two books. One that concentrates more on photography, and the other one really concentrates more on the cameras. And I don't know how early it is, but we do have, this is a small selection of our microscopes. So we have at least some of our microscopes that has connections to cameras. So if you're interested in seeing those, they're online as part of the digital collection. So you could also find them that way. Any other questions? In that case, we'll end it here.
Thank you all.
Thank you for coming.